philosophy comes from a time and place and a person, the word philosophy. And so it comes from Pythagoras, who lived around the 6th century BC in Greece. So Pythagoras, we know something about this figure. We know something about the system of teachings that he taught and where he comes from and the context in which he lived. And so, in my view, when we're talking about philosophy, it should be something that is accurately described as being philosophy should be in alignment with that original person of Pythagoras and the original vision that he had when he coined the term philosophy. And so another interesting thing about Pythagoras is that he lived during this period of time that he lived, the 5th century BC. This is known as the era of the great world teachers, because within a single century, you had Gautama Buddha emerge, you had Lao Tzu in China, you had Zoroaster in Persia, and you had a few other significant world teachers within the same century emerge. And each, in their different cultural systems, these teachers were all birthing essentially their own systems of philosophy in each of these different cultural groups. So just the specific term philosophy comes from Greece, it comes from Pythagoras.
Välkommen till Evolution Podcast. På äventyret att skapa en total evolution av individer och kultur. Där du och jag, som medvetna och trygga män, står i service till en värld där gemenskap, nyfikenhet, skaparkraft och visdom frodas. Genom modiga möten med våra gäster bjuder vi in dig att engagera dig till att bygga en kultur av ansvarstagande, trygghet och medvetenhet. Om inte nu, när? Om inte du, vem? Välkomna till Evolution Podcast. Vi är här med en spännande gäst där vi ska utforska filosofi och mysticism och vetenskap. So thank you very much for joining us today, Alex Sachon. Almost right?
Yep.
Almost correct. Yeah. And Alex is a student of philosophy and a deep thinker and an author, a podcaster, and I hope we will get invited to think deeper than we've ever done before. And in the end of this conversation, Alex, I hope that both of us will have new ideas, and for you who are listening, that we will stretch your minds and your hearts and your spirits to infinity, and then we'll see how far we go. How can you add some introduction to yourself, Alex?
Yeah, I have a podcast and Substack called The Wisdom Tradition, and I have 2 books out on Amazon. One's called Manly P. Hall, The Maestro of Esoteric Philosophy, and my newest one, which is only a couple weeks old, it's called The Coming World Nation, Why Global Government is Inevitable.
So, as a thinker and a researcher, what are you most inspired about in life right now?
Well, my focus right now really is looking at the great global crises that are erupting in different domains and trying to understand and really like model what they look like and how they have come to be, and then trying to look at what might lie on the other side of these challenges. Like what's a vision for an idealistic vision for the future of society and civilization, given these great transformations that take place. What we don't have at the moment, I think, as a culture, is a vision for the future. And so that's what I've been trying to articulate in my work, what that might look like, and what some of the philosophic ideas that inform that vision of the future. I try to explore that in my work.
So when it comes to, like, a lot of people are speaking about both like an awakening and then also speaking about a crisis, and I really believe in both parts. And also I see a lack of history awareness when it comes to crisis. Like, we can believe like, oh, now it's so bad, but if we look back in time, we can see that crisis happened many times over, and maybe now we have nukes and we have bigger kind of instruments of power in some sense. But to me, that kind of looking back historically gives a sense of calm and a trust that in some way, not to hide for responsibility, that but whatever will happen, there will be an outcome, and a faith that there will be a strengthening of culture and humanity and the earth as a whole. What do you see there in the vision, and if you both look like in the past and try to kind of grasp some of the wisdom of understanding different ages and seeing the current crisis?
Well, one of the things, I agree with you that there's been almost an unending series of crises as you go into the past. So that's the fact that there's crises going on is not necessarily new. However, the nature of the crises that we face today are global in nature, and we're also, for the first time, experiencing them as a collective, at like simultaneously through the internet and through the media and through social media. And so there's this new phenomenon of a shared collective experience of crises that are global in nature. And so this dynamic is facilitating ultimately the rise of like a global consciousness, a global sense of identity. And this is, emerging gradually, but this is one of those trends that are facilitating what I see as the inevitable coming of global government. So, so the nature of the crises that we're facing are global, and then the necessary response to meet and deal with these crises also requires global solutions. So, and there is, I think, a profound existential threat to some of the crises that we're facing. Like, for example, war. There's always been wars, but today, because of how destructive the weaponry and technologies are, the threat of war has the capacity to really do like massive destruction, global destruction. So, environmentally, you could also look at the potential for huge global effects, financially. So that's what's new today is like the magnitude and the scale of the crises and the demands that they require to be solved are also global in nature.
So when you speak about there's for sure like a more global awareness now. I imagine that when we were more like tribal people, some 10,000 plus years back, then there was also some kind of global awareness. There wasn't the awareness that people were in other continents, the countries in that sense, but the awareness level were more aligned, is what I'm imagining, than what it's been the past hundreds of years. And now we have all access to the same kind of data. But then also when it comes to the awareness of the global crisis, it comes to an awareness part of recognizing a crisis, recognizing the metamorphosis, or like we can view it from many different points of view, and there are facts that we can see and establish that as crisis. But I think it's also about there can be an assumption that we like the world today is very polarized in my perception, and there are extremes left, right, and black and white, and that's of course a kind of immature, unwise way to see things, as I understand it. And there's ways to see the gray scales and the complexity of things, and kind of get out of the idea that there is a solution to get somewhere. Like that's how I see like the matrix that a lot of people are trapped in. Like if I only get here, if I only achieve this, life will be great on an individual level. Same on group level, but also on a collective level. Like we got to solve this energy crisis, and then things will be great. It's like no, you will have other problems, and it probably will be bigger and more complex, but we also have more awareness to handle and tackle them. So can you touch on that? Like they are to kind of separate the facts and the awareness of an issue and crisis.
Can you unpack that a little bit more for me? Can you reword the question?
So there are facts and there is perception, and fact and perception is never the same. So
Right.
we can distinguish certain facts of, in the pandemic there was like specific facts of how many people were dying or sick, and then we can call that
Right.
a crisis, or we can call that a and maybe a very terrible way to see it is also a rebalancing of humanity. You know, it's a
Right.
perception shift, or it's also the level of awareness. Depending on the, say, the goals or the outcomes we have, we can say we can have an ideal that every human should live happily until they're 100 years old. That's an ideal. Or no people should starve, and that's another ideal. And depending on the ideals we have, it shifts our perception and way of analyzing the facts.
Hmm.
So in that case, like, how do you see our responsibility of seeing the facts from perception, and with crisis we can go into kind of victimhood, I see as a risk.
Right. The way I am looking at this issue is that this is actually one of the crises that we're facing is a crisis of sense perception, and how do we, like we said, there's lots of crises going on, but how these are defined, how these crises are defined, and how they're approached is like each one is mired in disagreement, is mired in misunderstanding, and like one of the themes of the period that we're in, I think there's an allegory from the Bible about the Tower of Babel and the confusion of tongues. And I see this, particularly this feature of the confusion of tongues, meaning an inability of people to understand and empathize with another person's perspective, or to for people to perceive that they're living in the same reality. Like COVID is a good example. Like people were living in very different realities in terms of there was an issue of illness and of government response, but the way people perceived what was going on was like people were living in completely different realities. Um, so that's one of the crises. You know, my take is that philosophy is like the key to solving this issue because as Manly Hall describes it, he's an American philosopher who I've done a lot of work with. But Manly Hall describes that one of the keys about philosophy is that it's about putting the mind in order, learning how to think, and learning the sort of like laws of the intellect. And I think we greatly are in need of a intellectual revolution, a global intellectual revolution that is centered around philosophy. Philosophy is this key resource that has been almost completely neglected and overlooked. And so we have the scientific age, and we have obviously this long religious history, but we don't have this third element of philosophy. We've almost completely like forgotten it. And so we need an intellectual renaissance and a philosophic renaissance. And I think that a lot of these issues that we're talking about perception will be solved through this new emergence, which I think will come in the coming years.
So can you dive deeper into what you mean, like intellectual revolution, like the laws of intellect? What are ways we can kind of enhance our thinking or ways of seeing things, or I would say like creating more of an ability or capacity to think in more complexity, but still be in peace and calm because we can handle the complexity with different thoughts simultaneously. How can you describe it, and what are some examples of these intellectual laws?
Well, part of it, I mean, part of it with philosophy is that it's based on first principles, and so there's certain fundamental ideas that everything else is built atop. And I would say like for example, the prioritization of the idea of unity, that things are founded in unity, is an aspect that's almost completely overlooked in our culture, but is the very basis of all thinking in philosophy, I would argue. There's always this understanding that any topic that you're talking about, any or any like intellectual system that you're trying to discuss in philosophy that can get complex, that all those things are always built atop a foundation of underlying unity. And but but yeah, unity is really not. We don't think about unity. It's not a factor in our scientific life or in our culture. And so what happens in the absence of unity is an overemphasis on diversity and individuality and focusing on the differences of things, and without understanding all things share a common underlying reality, or a connection to unity. All things are connected to the same one life. And so those are the type of things that in philosophy, uh, that philosophy has an opportunity to combine with science and religion and bring them into a common language, because it's this set of thinking that is really, uh, yeah, it's founded on universal ideas like unity, which are very simple. They're first principles, but our world would look very different. Our business philosophies will look very different if those things were built atop a foundation of appreciating the existence of an underlying unity. And so that's what I mean by the intellectual revolution. Like, if you could have the leaders of various departments of government or business, or intellect academics, or all these fields were to come to a common understanding about the baseline principles, things like unity, then that would be a huge shift for what we have today, where there's this extreme compartmentalization in terms of how people see the world, and there's this, going back to that biblical allegory, there's a confusion of tongues in terms of how people, about what motivates people's behavior and how people see the world. So a philosophical revolution, I think, would put people in the same mindset by learning a common system, a common framework of thinking that's very ancient.
Yeah, I had a conversation with a friend. I think this is an example, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. We had a conversation about animism, and I would say that that's the idea that everything has spirit, everything has life. Like if it's trees, or if it's the earth, or stones, or maybe other kind of entities, that there is an energy or spirit essence in everything. And in the idea of animism, it's that we are kind of one energy, one intelligence that are manifested in different kind of bodies or different entities, but it's all from the same. And in the honoring of that unity, then automatically we don't want to take advantage of other people. We don't want to take advantage of the earth or the resources in a way that kind of steals resources. We want to treat it, if we wouldn't treat the earth differently than we would treat ourselves. And of course, we don't necessarily treat ourselves the best, but still we wouldn't harm ourselves that bad. We wouldn't make big wounds in our bodies if we see that we wouldn't get stronger. We'd go for a workout and break our muscles in that way, because it was a holistic way of getting stronger. So that principle of unity that I think we can partly get from the idea of animism could help us to think deeper. And then we're kind of stuck in the performance world, where we want to measure things and want to achieve things and want to become the best. And in that perspective, or that philosophy, we want to take advantage of people and resources, and we want to win, and we want to win over others, and that always takes someone to lose, and that becomes creates a very combative environment. Would that make an example of this idea of unity with animism?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, what philosophy does is it also takes this underlying idea, and it builds out a whole creation story, and it explains the metaphysics involved. And so, like, one of the key things is that, and well, first off, when I say philosophy, like, if you go to a bookstore today, you go to the library and you go to the philosophy section, there is nothing but, I mean, you're going to find a lot of disagreeing ideas there. Like, there's a huge diverse opinion, and I think that's one of the reasons why philosophy has become sort of forgotten about, is that it's been mired in this intellectual conflict and disagreement, and so it can literally mean anything. Philosophy could be used to describe something that could mean like something that's spiritual, or something that's completely nihilistic. It's like, as long as it's like really intellectual and sort of high-minded, then it can be branded as philosophy. And so my take on it is that we have to go back and look at the root of the word, the origins of where philosophy comes from, and that'll give us the key, I think, to help solve this situation of disagreement that we have today about what it actually is philosophy, because we have so much differing ideas going on. So we got to realize that philosophy comes from a time and place and a person. The word philosophy, and so it comes from Pythagoras, who lived around the 6th century BC in Greece. So Pythagoras, we know something about this figure. We know something about the system of teachings that he taught and where he comes from and the context in which he lived. And so, in my view, when we're talking about philosophy, it should be something that is accurately described as being philosophy, should be in alignment with that original person of Pythagoras and the original vision that he had when he coined the term philosophy. And so another interesting thing about Pythagoras is that he lived during this period of time that he lived, the 5th century BC. This is known as the era of the great world teachers, because within a single century, you had Gautama Buddha emerge, you had Lao Tzu in China, you had Zoroaster in Persia, and you had a few other significant world teachers within the same century emerge. And each, in their different cultural systems, these teachers were all birthing essentially their own systems of philosophy in each of these different cultural groups. So just the specific term philosophy comes from Greece, it comes from Pythagoras. But there was basically this cohort of teachers that emerged within a single century. And this really is the birth of philosophy. It's not just from one single system, even though the specific word philosophy does come from Greece. But there was this common like set of teachings and disciplines, and they all held something in common. They all have the fundamentals of the teachings of these different groups that emerged during this period, all shared certain core similarities. And so that system of teachings and the basic fundamental things and teachings that these systems all shared in common, this is, I think, the gold standard of what is philosophy originally intended to mean. And there was a couple generations after this initial lineage of teachers, particularly in Greece. We can look at Plato as being a successor to Pythagoras, who further articulated and developed philosophy. And then in the 2nd to 3rd century AD in Alexandria, there were new schools of philosophy that emerged out of these original schools, and they further embellished philosophy. But this lineage that I'm talking about, this is the true like gold standard of what philosophy means. And so what I'm saying also, we need an intellectual revolution that's philosophical. I'm talking specifically about rediscovering this golden thread that originates around 6th century BC and winds its way to today. And so this is that lineage that we need to rediscover, and this is the key, I think, to correcting the crisis that we're having in our scientific community and in scientific knowledge and the sort of misuse of science into building these technologies which have the capacity to be really destructive. And also rectifying and sort of unifying these religious conflicts that we've had for a long period. Because philosophy is that missing link that unites science and religion, I argue. And so that's all encompassed by what I'm talking about with this need to have an intellectual revolution. And again, when you look at the teachings of Pythagoras, he really talks about the philosophy of number. And we were talking about unity. That's been a theme that we've been discussing. So, in our numerical system, like 1 comes before all the other numbers. And when you like dissect, particularly Manly Hall does a good job of this, dissecting the philosophy of Pythagoras. It's like unity comes first, and then you build incrementally. 2 has a meaning, 3 has a meaning, the number 4 has a meaning. So the meaning of each thing comes subsequent to the initial unity. So this is what I'm talking about. There's like a very specific disciplined way of understanding like the first principles. You establish those and you work with those, and then there's a very specific way of doing it, and that's what philosophy articulates, and it's like about putting the mind in order.
And I would understand philosophy as a way of thinking to explain the world, explain life, to kind of in a rational way explain how I'm functioning, how self and understanding the interaction between humans and whole societies as well as the world. So an exact philosophy has there are no words that can describe the actual creation, because that would kind of be an opposite of creation itself. Then it would be creation. There is the map is not the
Right.
territory,
Right.
but it's the attempt to, at the best of our ability, be so exact and precise to describe the laws and the rules and the principles that we can understand ourselves, others, and other things with.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah, I would add something to that. Philosophy. All right. So first off, I really can't recommend to any of your listeners, like if you haven't listened to Manly Hall's lectures before or read any of his books, I highly recommend his work. He is an American philosopher, but he's, I think, one of the great teachers, particularly philosophic teachers that ever existed, because he simplifies the not only the teachings of philosophy, but he gives you the whole history of philosophy and really discusses its origin story. And in the way he describes it, philosophy wasn't something that was invented by man. It was something that was bestowed by the gods. And it was always the knowledge was not only bestowed, but also the system by which you disseminate that knowledge. So so what was bestowed was the teachings and the schoolhouse. Essentially, it's what they call it. In Buddhism, you call it the Sangha, and then the doctrine of teaching. So those always go together, and so this system has descended from very, very ancient times. The system of a schoolhouse and a sacred doctrine of teachings that have to do with exactly what you were just talking about, the keys to the laws that govern our world, not only govern the external world, but also govern the human psyche and the growth processes and evolutionary processes. So these things are determined by a law, a divine law. The laws of nature are essentially the system of divine law. And so philosophy is about not only intellectually learning and coming to understand how these laws work, uh, but also how they act upon you and how to navigate these energies and these laws in order to facilitate your own evolution. That's the purpose of philosophy. Really, it's like the way I look at it is that in the lower kingdoms of nature, the process, the laws of nature kind of work to facilitate evolution without necessarily the conscious participation of those lower life forms. But with the human kingdom, with humanity, we have to learn we have to use our capacity for intellect to learn those laws, and then we have to actually fulfill them for ourselves. So we have to participate in our own evolutionary growth. Like nature's not going to drag us through it. We have to discover it. And so that's also what the philosophic schools were about, is they, anciently, the various degrees and grades of these schools were governed, like what separated them were these degrees of initiation. And that initiation, like as you proceed in that degree program, those are actually the stages of your own evolution. Like the schoolhouse originally, that's what the meaning of that was. So the sacred system of knowledge prepared this person and guided them through this initiation process, which actually was designed to enhance their evolutionary growth. And so philosophy is derived from this ancient system of like sacred knowledge that was bestowed, and the ancient philosophical schools had this mission of enhancing human evolution. And so when we have the great intellectual revolution to come requires the rebuilding of this schoolhouse on a global level, a philosophic school, rediscovering of the ancient sacred teachings, and then this commitment that we're, this life sort of mission becomes like the progression of and the perfection of ourselves from an evolutionary standpoint.
That's very inspiring to hear when you describe it like that. It's that you describe very much the way we see like the evolution podcast, but as way as the movement that we are working to build is really like a modern. We attempt to build a modern schoolhouse
Hmm.
and uh, trying to realize what is an effective way to communicate and uh, the sacred knowledge, but also to have a self-generating pool of knowledge through the collective wisdom.
Hmm.
And I think that's an issue that's been a challenge. Like as I said before, I live in the anthroposophical center of the Nordic, and I'm not studying or a member of the anthroposophic community, but Rudolf Steiner was a great thinker. And
Hmm.
one of his laws or one of his clear statements was, in 100 years, all my books have to be burned because then my ideas are too old. You need to take these ideas and take them into yourself. And you need to study, you need to understand how you can apply this, and then you need to evolve from that. And
Hmm.
if you don't, like my books won't help you. And of course, today we can see that his books or whatever knowledge we haven't been able to integrate it and evolve from it. Like very few anthroposophical thinkers are beyond his thinking, or if any, right?
Hmm.
And I think that's the system that we can create today, also with the global collective, but really to synergize and synthesize the ideas into to kind of practical tools for living an effective life.
Hmm.
And I'm also very inspired about like there's a simpler, I don't know if you said simpler life forms, but you can say like uh, um, in the seed of the pine. The seed of the pine has the potential to become a huge pine, right?
Hmm.
And the seed of the pine kind of has that knowing of its potential and needs some ingredients to become its full potential, this big and beautiful
Hmm.
tree. In the same way, I have a lot of cows strolling around on the fields here. Like the when the calf, what's it called, the baby cow is born,
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
has the innate potential of becoming this big cow or this big bull. It's there,
Right.
but in the human consciousness, we have this it's the first life form probably on Earth, this huge capability to forget our innate truth. We have
Hmm.
the capacity to forget who we are and why we are here, and we need
Hmm.
to forget that so we can relearn it, so we can remember it. And that's kind of the
Hmm.
path of coming back to the unity that we were separated from, maybe at birth or whenever we were separated from that. And that's for me,
Hmm.
like that's the exciting journey of being a human. Like that's so
Hmm.
much fun to experience the pain of this separation
Hmm.
and the longing to come back into this unity and have these kind of moments and flashes of unity, and then going back to the matrix of separation again, and building an internal and external world of harmony.
Hmm. Yeah, I would add a couple of things to that, which is I think one of the reasons why we had to go through this process of forgetting is that in the process of doing that, we developed new aptitudes that had previously been latent, and I'll explain what I mean by that. When you go back to look at ancient societies, you find in every across the globe they all had a version of the caste system. And in the caste system, your personal sense of self identity is completely enmeshed within your position in society. And that's one thing I think we take for granted today is the fact that, or at least people in the West take for granted today, is that we have this strong sense of like ego identity, whereas in previous uh, anciently that was very much like a repressed function. And so one of the things that we've gone through in this sort of rise of materialism and rise of like secularism is that that has created an environment for us to experiment with the expression of our own ego identity and to construct a sense of mission for ourselves as individual persons. And and they also there's also like especially in the kind of esoteric philosophical writings they talk about how when you go back and look at really ancient human beings that the subconscious was much more active and the sense of like material perception, physical sense perception was a little bit different back then. And so people lived much more or participated much more actively with their unconscious. And with sort of, when you go really far back, people talk about a third eye being open and people having sort of clairvoyant perception. And so the idea that these faculties gradually closed over time, going up to today, that has given an opportunity for the intellect, the aspect of the mind that we're very much engaged in today, very cognitive, very intellectual. The scientific age has been really like huge for developing those faculties. That there was a need within, talking about evolutionary speaking, there was a need for the human soul to activate and develop these capacities for ego and for intellect. And so undergoing a period of time of this forgetting, of this materialism, of this sense of self-isolation, like for us, we experience it as being living through it almost like a dark age. But on the longer timeline, from an evolutionary standpoint, it was necessary for us to build these aspects that will take on into the future with us as we continue to evolve. But we had to go through this period of time in order to like activate these things that had been repressed within us for a long period of time beforehand.
And what I see there is the issue with all these times in history is that attachment to one way of being is like being connected to, if you speak about being connected to the third eye, but not the intellect, or like we're connected to the, in the very, very ancient times, we're connected to the root chakra of like basic survival, and that was active. And now what I see, the like revolution, and we call it the evolution of philosophy, I would say it's the integration and the capacity to navigate consciously between these layers of awareness and choose what to do when. I had an example, a friend spoke, he's been a lot into Africa. I don't know if this was Mozambique or it was, but he was to visit a friend. This was like 15 years ago. And he came there and he came to the airport, was waiting on the bus, and the bus didn't come for like an hour. And he called his friend and it's like, hey, when does the bus come? And his friend said, it will come. And he's like, but when? He's like, it will come. And then my friend sat there waiting for I think 5-6 hours, not knowing when the bus were to come. And he was looking around at these native people, just being fascinated because they sat there and they didn't do anything. And they sat there, like they didn't meditate, they just sat and they looked straight forward. Like that's a peace a Westerner can't have. Like it's just, it's like ants in the body, right? Because we're so focused on fixing these issues. We're so, it's scary to be there. But then to have the capacity to think really powerfully, like in our work, we work with it's focused on men's work, and a lot of men think they're thinking, but they're actually just spinning the same ideas because they don't have the intellectual tools to move from one point to another of seeing in different perspective. Many men are not trained to make powerful decisions in alignment with who they are in the complexity of the world. So they're just thinking, but they're actually in anxiety, and it's their emotions guiding their thinking. It's not their thinking guiding their emotions, and it's not the spirit guiding their thinking. And I think that could be also one of these kind of higher perspective principles. And there's a quote in the Bible that speaks about this also. It's like the mind governed by the flesh is hell. But the body guided by the mind, if the mind is governed by the spirit, is heaven.
And it's interesting. I mean, there's also there's very Buddhist ideas in there as well. You know, that's almost like that could be from Buddhism. That statement. Yeah, and that's what ultimately, you know, philosophy is not just a set of like intellectual teachings. It's a whole discipline designed to fix the very problem that you're speaking about. And there's initiation degrees that are required to get from one stage of the school to the next stage. Those are designed to test you on your ability to gain mastery in those fields. For example, you know, not letting the emotions become the dictator of your actions,
Yeah.
and to have your mind, centered. Um,
I want to share we have 9 principles in evolution. I want to share the first one. I will try to translate it and get your input on it on a philosophical perspective or esoteric philosophy.
mhm.
And I want to introduce that with I see an issue, and that's a world that has been living in revolutions over revolution over revolution. And my definition of revolution is that there is a denial of the strength of the previous period and the identification of now we have the answer, and what was past sucked and now is the best, and this is the solution, and this is the one thing that will solve everything. And then one goes from the far left to the far right, or whatever, or we go from the extreme performance or meritocratic society to this, like everyone is equal. And today in Sweden, football teams, they can't, with kids, they don't get to keep scores, because then people will feel like losers. You want to protect them from
Really?
feeling bad. Yeah, it's crazy.
Wow.
So that's the other extremes. That's a revolutionary way of thinking. Like we
Right.
measure, or we don't measure. And as I see, the act of evolution is to not go that path, but it's to still evolve to higher levels of consciousness, awareness, and living and being. But it's through the act of honoring.
Hmm.
And if any, so our first principle, in short, is honoring, and that states basically, if you're not honoring what is, don't move ahead, don't move forward, because then you will, if you are in judgment of what is, you will uh, recreate the judgment, because you're in a basically a fight or flight state of your mind, in judgment of what is isn't good. And as the first law of the universe would then be the law of the unity, is that there is no lack, there is no scarcity, there is abundance. And if you're not aware of it right now, you won't be aware of it even if you win the football game or sell your business or get married or whatever it is. You'll find
Hmm.
something else where there's lack. So the principle is honoring of the, honoring the gift of life,
Hmm.
honoring of nature, of humanity, as the sons, as the fathers, and as the brothers we are. This is
Hmm.
the honoring of previous and coming generations.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely important. So is it about honoring? It's about honoring other people or other perspectives, or about honoring just like the fact that you exist in a larger creation, and sort of being humble to that, to
So
to the
I
to your.
would include all. So it's the honoring of this moment. It's the honoring of where I am, where you are in life. It's in honoring of where the world is. It's in honoring of the crisis, and by that, like seeing the logic and the beauty of the cause and effect of cause and effect and cause of effect over time, and see that
Hmm.
that is beauty. That's just kind of the essence of God in creation. And I
Hmm.
might not be able to conceptualize that because my philosophy might not be as developed, but I seek the capacity to honor life as it is right now before I move ahead, before I attempt to make solution.
Hmm. Yeah. What
So there are
one thing?
improvements. Yeah,
Yeah, go
please.
ahead. Well, I was going to say that one thing I think is important is to honor and attempt to discern the invisible forces, the invisible archetypes that are behind the physical people and events that we experience. And and that's one of the things that philosophy really teaches us, is that um, is to understand that the physical world that we exist in is surrounded by a metaphysical context, and that metaphysical context has its own laws, it has its own powers, it has its own dynamics, and those dynamics, when they occur, they shape everything that happens in our material world. And so so in the ancient religions, when they talked about gods, they were really talking about these invisible powers in space, these archetypes that have the power to shape our life. And so the part of their religious practices was to honor these archetypes within their lives, their day-to-day lives, and to always pay attention to like how they were manifesting. And so that idea that I'm talking about is really the key to understanding like how they understood astrology, because they revered, and all ancient cultures did this. This is an essential part of the ancient philosophy, is understanding that the planets and the zodiac and these things, that they're not about like physical planets in the night sky. What they're understanding is that they're indicative of the metaphysical world that surrounds our physical planet. And that's why the different configurations of the planets and of the celestial bodies in relation to the zodiac have the power to change our world, and why you can see these patterns in what happens here being reflected in the motions of the sky, is because the sky is not just a physical thing, and our planet is not just a physical thing. It's actually, there's this metaphysical context, and astrology is really a key to understanding what those dynamics are. And like Manly Hall does a great job of showing this, that like when you dissect the basic structure of astrology in terms of like how it describes this metaphysical system I'm talking about, and then you compare that to the old religious myths, you'll understand that the gods of these stories are mapping onto these different elements of this astrological system, and that what this is really talking about is this metaphysical context that shapes our minds, it shapes our bodies, it shapes the worlds that we live in. And so I think that's like the more progressed or the more advanced version of what you're talking about, like honoring the things that you're seeing and being humble to the context that you're in, is to then take the step beyond there and see, these are the spiritual powers that are speaking to me, these archetypes that are communicating with me and acting through me, and to honor and give space to those, because you can really change the way these archetypes affect you and affect the world around you by changing how you engage with them. So by making the choice to do something like honoring them, or doing like a ritual to really focus on these invisible energies, these invisible powers, you change the way that you relate to them.
Can you so honoring? Could you give an example of what that could look like in an ancient tradition, or a way that you're practicing this?
I mean, yeah, let me think. Well, Saturn is is an important planet in astrology, and it tends to be known for having like harsh, final, sort of like often like trial and tribulations kind of effects on people. And so that trial, like if you're a really blocked off person, you're not very introspective, and if you're engaging with life entirely on a materialistic level, then Saturn will affect you in terms of usually causing some kind of crisis in your external life. But the point of that external crisis is really to get you to have a psychological response to it. What Saturn's really trying to do is bring out that psychological response within you. So if you kind of advance, and Carl Jung did a lot of work with this. So like I really recommend Jung and the depth psychology view, because they go into looking at these same topics I'm talking about, particularly like astrology and the relationship between the different planets and zodiac signs, and how we experience life psychologically. But if you were to, the idea is, if you were to then instead make an active effort of understanding that you have this Saturn archetype that's trying to communicate with you, and it wants to drive your personal evolution and get you to confront things that you're not looking at. If you change and you start to become active in your engagement with this Saturn archetype, then Saturn doesn't necessarily have to get your attention by causing a crisis in your external life. You can engage with that crisis entirely on the inner psychological level, and Saturn can get the response it wants on that, but with that personal engagement over, necessarily causing an external crisis. So that's the kind of idea I'm talking about. Is like you can change the way that these archetypes interact with you.
And it can also be that the universe seems to have a way of giving people crisis, and the more we are attached to certain specific outcomes, then the universe tends to give us the crisis we need to humble ourselves to get to a place where we don't know.
Exactly.
We live in a world that we're trying to control everything, and as long as we do that, we're trying to be gods that we are not, and often then denying what we actually can control as our free will. But then to come to a place of humility, and it's like, okay, I in some way surrender, I give up. My intellect cannot answer this question, it's too complex, and I have to submit to some kind of force or some kind of power, and stand in, I mean, maybe stand in awe, or anyway in an openness of learning.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think you got it right on. That's how it works, because the planetary system that we're involved in, it is ruled by law, and it's being driven towards a state of final completion, final realization. And so that final state of universal enlightenment, let's say that's the ultimate end goal. Everything, when you just go backwards in time, everything is working ultimately towards the realization of that final attainment. And so there's a law and a pattern that's driving that process. And so any resistance that we try to give, like humanity has the capacity to express self-will. But if we express self-will that's out of alignment with that underlying evolutionary process, the universe, the laws of nature are going to orchestrate a situation just naturally that are designed to break us of that resistance that we're trying to give this system. So if we try to stand in the way of progress, if we're trying to, exert our will to try to block this, even if we don't intend to, but if we're doing anything that is blocking this long-term growth, nature's going to design a strategy to put us in a series of circumstances that will humble us.
And a very practical example that could be like in human relationships, when we try to control another, they might listen, they might allow us to be controlled for a while, but then at some point they will rebel, and we will drop to our knees in the realization that we had trying to grasp control over something we couldn't, and that there will be humility there.
Yeah, that's the hardest situation with that, in my experience, is like in relationships. Like if you're in like a really committed to relationship with somebody, then it's hard to have that balancing act where it's like you want to maybe guide them in a certain direction, or you want to control, not necessarily overtly control them, but there's this dynamic of like always testing you of like, how much can I just accept this person for who they are and resist my desire to like change them, or to somehow exert my will to make them a certain way. I think for me, being in relationships is like, I've always been a good test of that dynamic in my own life.
Yeah. So with this, to go a bit deeper on so you spoke about the caste ego identity and this like collective identity, and also coming back to like the global government. I see like the risk of centralization is that one speak for the many, and there is less diversification when there is globalization. And then there's a power of it because we can create laws, but then when there is not law of the Martini called the one to many and many to one, that everything moves from one to many and then it moves back again. And so there can be a need of global structure and global government, but then also I see the emerging and kind of acute need of local community and local government, and like way more local. Like Sweden is a small country, like we're about 10 million people here,
Mm-hmm.
but on way more local power distribution,
Mm-hmm.
and also like real connection in a way that there were in tribal communities, that people had a say. They were, one could argue, one was valued for the gift, and everyone were dependent on each other in a way that today we don't realize how many people were dependent on, but very few people would survive more than 3 or 4 days because we don't have an understanding of our needs get filled.
Right.
But some 100 years back ago, we understood the trade and the effort it took to sustain our lives. So
Mm-hmm.
how do you see that kind of the both dive a bit deeper on the need of global government, but also how we can balance that with local strong communities, or if you see the need of that, or if we are evolving away from such needs?
Well, yeah, I think that what you're saying is definitely the concern, which is, we have basically a crisis in governance, and we have endemic corruption basically all throughout the world. And so, if we're not able to fix that on the level of nation states, then it would be the ultimate disaster to have global government, but as bad governance. That would be the worst possibility. And so, a lot of people who are against the idea of global government are against it for that reason. But I argue that there's a lot of different like big picture trends that are pushing things in this direction, that it's an inevitability. And the primary one that's driving this change, and makes global government a necessity, is that, and this is what I argue in my new book, and I go in comprehensive detail telling the story. But according to my research, in the 19th century, kind of the early days of the Industrial Revolution and the early days of the scientific really emergence, the industrial age and the scientific age kind of really took off together. So relatively early on in that process, there was a series of scientific and technological discoveries that we don't hear about today because they've been classified, but they have to do with a science of energy related to the idea of the ether. And the ether is an old alchemical concept. It's a part of this ancient philosophical tradition I was discussing earlier. But what happened in the 19th century is that it got rediscovered in a modern scientific context. So rather than be passed down through this lineage of philosophic schools, there was a new cohort of scientists and engineers who discovered this paradigm of the ether. And the ether is essentially the idea that there's a universal field that contains the physical reality that we exist in, and that through electromagnetism, by manipulating electromagnetism, you can interface with this etheric field, and you can draw energy from it, and you can actually change a lot of the properties of material forms by interfacing with this ether. And so the ether was really what Nikola Tesla was working with. But even before the times of Nikola Tesla, there's evidence that there were key discoveries made in this field a long time ago. And then right around the turn of the century, when the 1900s began, any science or physics research, engineering research that was being done in this field of etheric energy, which was relatively popular in the 19th century, as soon as the 20th century comes, it's like it all disappears, like it had been covered up, and we basically instead are given like Einstein, general relativity, and basically the various components of what we consider like modern science emerged after this older discovery of the ether was sort of classified and disappeared. And so in my book, I tell this story, and then I talk about how the rise of American empire that happened in the 20th century, sort of to like at the heart of that project, concealed from almost everybody within the empire. So even like the power structures that we associate, like the Rockefellers and J.P. Morgan and people like that, who were really big in shaping the trajectory of America and turning it into an empire, which it has been for the past 100 years, and this globally powerful empire. that at a very secret level within this structure, but away from almost anybody, there's a scientific institution that was set up, a secret governance body that has sort of taken control of this paradigm of physics I've been talking about, the ether, which is about this unified field of energy, and it has been sort of developing it and but keeping it under wraps for over a century, and is sort of quietly social engineering the world, and is one of the drivers of this process of global government, globalization that we were talking about earlier. And so one of the main trends that I think is driving this push towards global government, and one of the things that makes it inevitable and I think necessary actually, is the power of this scientific field that I'm talking about, regarding the ether, and the power of the technologies that can be developed using it they're so tremendous, the opportunities and the challenges that it presents, that you can't have competing nation states leveraging this technology and doing war with each other. It's so powerful, it's so game changing, that it requires a global governance system to ever be revealed. And I think that's why it's been kept secret for over 100 years, is that there hasn't been yet an adequate system of governance put in place capable of like successfully harnessing this resource. Because unlike nuclear weapons, which require a bunch of materials to process and refine and turn into a bomb, the etheric energy field, it can be accessed by anybody with has advanced enough knowledge just from your local garage. If you have just a small amount of materials, you can start to manipulate it, and you can cause big cascading disasters potentially. So there's a need to consolidate governance across the globe before this technology can ever be revealed. So that's one of the things my book is really my new book is really based around an exploration of this idea, because it's something that I don't think has been well articulated yet in the research community, or in people who are trying to understand what's going on in the world. This idea that there's a secret scientific institution in America that has this advanced, what we would consider an exotic system of science and technology that is held for over a century. Like, this is the central player that's driving world events, and has been, as I argue in the book. And this is, and the thing is, I actually take a sympathetic view for why it would insist on secrecy this whole time, and why it has been driving and pushing for global government, because the nature of this energy resource essentially demands this global governance institution. So even though I sympathize with what you were saying about how there's a need to balance local governance and global governance, and you don't want to have the local sovereignty of individual places totally eroded. Because of this energy issue I'm talking about, there is a definite need for a global coordinating entity that can oversee the implementation of this energy source, which would, when implemented, will forever change the course of our material civilization.
So if I would understand in completely different words, I would imagine that in the tribal culture, like living in the Amazon or living in an abundant nature, then there is a life experience of abundance. And then for the past, say, 400 years, definitely since the Renaissance, and also for the time of religion, there has been a time of scarcity. And scarcity is great, because then we can control people, and we can make them go to church, and it's only the priest that can say that you're forgiven, otherwise you go to hell. It's a very powerful control system. But if I understand you correctly, with the etheric energy field, that you're basically speaking about theory and study of that will create a world of abundance, where there will be no scarcity of energy, and when there's no scarcity of energy, we will be able to transmute that into other areas of life as well. So there is no need for competition or trying to win, because there is actually nothing to win, because you can't lose, because there is so much.
Yeah, that's true. Although I think people who are researching, there's a lot of people who are interested in this field of etheric energy now. I think the mistake that they make is to assume that it's free in the sense that you can do whatever you want with it. Like you can draw as much as you want and you can use it however you wish. But I would argue that that's not the case. That although this energy resource can be drawn from essentially without limit, that like I said, it's interacting with this metaphysical field that has its own laws and dynamics to how it operates. And so in using etheric energy, those have to be respected. Those laws have to be respected. And that's what was always taught in alchemy and in astrology, as it was practiced as an ancient philosophical discipline, is that you studied these things so you could learn how to harness these energies in a constructive way. That's why the temples were all built. Ancient temple sites were all built basically as mirrors of the heavenly order, and the locations of the different ancient temple sites are located at positions on Earth that are associated with these important constellations. That's because those specific physical sites were designed using an ancient engineering concept. They were designed to be channels of these energies. And so we have to understand and appreciate that when we're now looking today about using new types of technologies to harness these metaphysical energies, because if you don't respect the larger metaphysical world that we're interfacing with as we interact with these energies, then we're breeding a type of catastrophe that Manly Hall talks about Atlantis long ago under a different context, but having been the collapse of Atlantis having been involved, or ancient civilization having been involved with manipulating these etheric energies, these metaphysical energies, not technologically like we're doing today, but really more through the misuse of like ritual magic and ancient occult doctrines that the ancient priesthoods would really specialize in back then, that they were responsible for setting up a series of basically pollution, psychic pollution within this metaphysical field, and that ended up causing a series of catastrophes that ultimately destroyed that civilization. I mean, that's what the ancient myths always tell us, that this ancient civilization was destroyed not by accident, but as a karmic response to its own evils that had set in. Its own like shadow elements basically consumed it from within. And so we can look at that. We have to learn the lesson from that and understand that the use of these energies is much more. It can't be used secularly. These have to be integrated with a larger sort of religious and philosophical understanding, the science of this etheric energy. So that's the key, is that they hold a key to abundance, but there's also a set of like disciplines that we have to utilize. So we can't really use it however we want. We have to like use it according to the laws that determine how these energies work.
So I don't know what superhero it's who says that, but with great powers come great responsibility, and it's the alignment of those, and it's a big issue. Another way of seeing that, go back to relationship. If love grows faster than trust, it's a big issue. So I need to develop both the force of love and the container of love, that is trust, to be able to manage and create something long term. So in this perspective of the then global government, how do you see that can be managed? I hear it cannot be a secular primarily government. It needs to have some kind of faith-based or ritual-based or principle-based. And when it comes to government, like the fear is to be controlled, right? That the free will is limited. But what are your thoughts there? How a global government could actually serve both individuals, families, and cities and nations in a balanced way of not getting in too much control? And then we come to the issue of if you want to see a man, if you want to see who man really is, give him a lot of power, and his shadow will be shown.
That's a good question. I think Francis Bacon, who's a figure I've done a lot of work on my website and on my podcast. Um, Francis Bacon really, I think, gave us the key in his book New Atlantis, which is, Francis Bacon was a very far-sighted visionary and a genius and really a mystic, secretly like a very profound mystic and sage. He like the year of his death, he put out an unfinished novel called New Atlantis, and he gives this is right at the beginning of the scientific age, and he was really the godfather of the scientific age. He really articulated the philosophy of science in earlier works like the advancement of learning. But then in the New Atlantis, he envisions in this short story, he envisions a sort of scientific age utopian society, and the key in his vision is that the government of the society is actually rooted in a university system, and I think that this is the key to make a system of global governance actually work. Is that it's really the government becomes almost overshadowed by a university system, and so the global university system. The idea is that the leaders of that global government system would be products of this university, and they would only advance in their position of power insofar as they advanced in this graduated in this to a high degree in this university. And so the degree of power and the degree of like attainment, philosophical attainment, would be matched essentially. And this is basically the pattern of how the mystery schools used to work in ancient societies. That the mystery, like the leaders of societies, were anciently graduates of these ancient mystery schools, and philosophy was born out of the mystery schools. So philosophy is essentially the modern version of that. And so the key is to have a university system and to have the government tethered to that university system in a formal way. And that's how I think you can bring government into alignment with, ensuring that it doesn't go off into like a totalitarian angle. Is to ground it in education, philosophic education.
So under this, I hear you spoke about I don't know if you spoke about the ultimate enlightenment, something like that before, like that we're heading towards an enlightenment, and you spoke about the utopia, and there's a lot of dystopic views as well. But I see that both the idea of utopian and dystopia as kind of subconscious reflections of our desire and our fears of heaven and hell. And I see that there's like an escape of longing to get out of the pain of the human experience, to be able to get to heaven, or what the symbol of heaven is.
Mm-hmm.
And I like the idea of like, if say there is a God, and the God is the like source essence or whatever you want to call it, and that's the unity, and the unity wanted to experience itself, and therefore it created separation. And the second
Mm-hmm.
part of creating separation was forgetting the unity.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore the essence of unity could experience itself as separation coming back to unity.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of a fun game. That's the getting in and out of matrix, but playing the game of it as a fun experience. And
Mm-hmm.
because of this, I question the purpose of utopia. I question the purpose of heaven. I question right now we're in a time of kind of a lot of individual healing. Like there's a lot of time and space where people can go to have philosophical conversations, or to go to therapy or whatever, to kind of embody more essence, and not be weighed down by the burdens of the past.
Mm-hmm.
And that creates some experiences of feeling lighter, and seeing wholeness instead of separation, and we can call that part of enlightenment. But I want to question the purpose of utopia, the purpose of an end goal of of utopian enlightenment, because that for me limits the awareness of that we're living in the utopia right now, and this is an utopian experience that you and me are having right now, and parts of our or of my consciousness is tethered to that heaven in this moment, and many parts are not. Most parts are not. But it's the desire of something else, something better that is out there, that I think pushes the enlightenment further from ourselves as individuals and as societies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see what you're saying. I, 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 I think there has to be a reality where both things are true. That there is an ideal to strive for. Obviously, that we can do better than what where we are right now, and it's important, I think, to acknowledge that. But at the same time, I understand what you're saying about that kind of mindset takes you out of the present, and being fully present. I think like radically, like a mystical sense, present is where you can discover that you can discover, like you were saying, you can discover the reality of what you hope for in the future is attainable at the present moment. But I think that there's some balance between the two, because I do think that the like evolutionary speaking, there is a well. Let me step back. Let me describe like what is influencing my thinking on this. Is that basically like the way I conceive it is that the reality that we exist in is a lot like what you were describing. It's unity moving into diversity and then reawakening to unity, and I would describe that as basically a deliberate meditation. It's a universal mind entering into a cycle of activity, and what that really is like it enters into a meditation and goes inward within itself, and it populates this world, and it's driving the evolution. Like as the world evolves, that evolution is really tracking the progress of this meditation. And so the culmination of the cycle and the culmination of the meditation would be universal enlightenment, in the sense that that's the reawakening of the one mind out of its meditation and resolving itself back to its own unity. And then there's a period of rest, and then this proceeds again on a higher level. So there's that larger creation story right there that is like for me like the founding idea, like the most important essential underlying idea for our that informs our own lives, and it informs the social drama that we're participating in. And so I do feel like that meditation has a goal that it wants. Like it is creating this world and fulfilling it at every second for a reason, and it wants to drive us towards a certain state of self-perfection, a certain state of realization. And I do think that ultimately to achieve that final realization, you have to do the things that you're talking about. You have to have the ability to recognize the utopia that is at every second, that state of like spiritual interconnectivity, and that is always present. It's not just something to strive for and attain in the future. But at the same time, I do think at an advanced level you do realize that. But we also live in a world with incredible amounts of suffering, and I do think that it would be a lot to ask a kid who's living in Gaza right now to just realize the utopia that is available at every second when they're engaged in that kind of volatile environment, and the threat of death is everywhere. And so I do think for us, people who aren't in that situation but looking on that situation, we can feel like compassion for their situation, and realize like if we don't take the initiative with people who have agency and maybe a capacity to make a change, like if we don't have that vision and work towards it, and do what's necessary, even if what's necessary are things that take us away from that state of like bliss and being in the moment, then so I do feel like there's a responsibility for us to have that larger vision and to work towards it. And sometimes, I mean, ideally we would be doing that while in that state of mind that you were talking about, of realizing the utopia is at present. But I also have a belief that like sometimes you need to earn sometimes there are things that are required of us that we have to accomplish for us to earn the right to have those experiences that you're describing, and that there is a synchronicity that takes place, there is a chemistry that takes place in the world that we're living, that the deeds that we do in the world, the outer world, will somehow be reflected to the states that we experience inwardly. And so so yeah, I'm agreeing with you, but I also definitely feel like it's good to have a sense of mission and purpose, like in your outer life, and to be dedicated, and to be willing to make sacrifices, even if that sacrifice, if it's for a greater good, if the sacrifice is your own peace of mind at a given time, that's a trade-off that's sometimes worth making.
Yeah, I like the both and perspective, but it's also easy to get caught up in the ideals of how things should be. Like that there's an ideal that there shouldn't be any wars. Like that would be great if people weren't sick and there were no wars, but that's also like a human infatuation, I would say, because there's always been wars, and it's quite likely there will be crimes and people will kill each other for one reason or another. Beautiful if it doesn't happen, but it's easy to get into. It's like Mark Manson translating some Buddhist philosophy, saying that the desire for a positive experience is in itself a negative experience, and an acceptance of a negative experience is in itself a positive experience. But actually,
That's
that
right.
wasn't the quote. It was something else, but it's come from the same origin. It's that there is the two reasons for human suffering, and that is the desire to change what's attain what's unattainable, and avoid what is unavoidable.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of these visions that people put up are actually in alignment with that. And then there's actually a plan for suffering and going back to the matrix of drama. And I think we can, I believe in what you started with the beginning, like we need a new vision and we need missions. But I think we can save ourselves a lot of energy if we have, say, aligned vision and mission with what I would say universal truth, and that there is no attachment to life or death. There is no
Mm-hmm.
attachment to health or disease, because both are part of the whole, and
Mm-hmm.
nothing is more right or more wrong. And that's easy, as you said, to be here sitting in the US, in Sweden, being very privileged for sure. But it's also like, can we step in to help the people that are poor, are struggling, and that want to receive help, but not in the sense of like I will fix you, or I will
Right.
clean my karma because I'm actually coming from shame. That's very common for people that are stepping
Right.
on the hero cape.
Right.
But I'm
Yeah, I
doing
see
this
what you're saying.
from truth. I'm doing this from essence, and I do this because my spirit calls me to it, and my spirit leads my mind, it leads my body. But I won't. Nothing is done or nothing will be undone, no matter what I do or don't do. But I do it for kind of the pleasure or the enjoyment of the expression of the truth at my best ability. But in the end
Mm-hmm.
of my days, I will have made, some people will appreciate me, some will hate me, but it's been a continuous experience of wholeness.
Mm-hmm. No,
And the
I
prayer
agree.
is to align with that.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's a very advanced way of approaching it.
And see, time flew very fast. I just been so fascinating. This been so much fun, Alex. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of
Before
course.
you kind of share where people can find you, we'll share the links and to your website, to your Substack, and to your podcasts, and to your books in the show notes. What do you have kind of like as a final invitation for diving into philosophy, or what can people do, like as an advice or a question people can ponder on to realize more what you think is needed?
Sure. Well, my basic take on philosophy that I was describing earlier is at the last two chapters of the Manly Hall book that I have go into that. And one of the chapters is called Philosophy, Religion, and Science, a trilogy or a trinity, I think it's called. But that's about this fundamental interconnection, or describing what philosophy is in relation to religion and science, and showing how these things are meant to be aligned as a triumvirate. And then the last chapter is called The Destiny of Philosophy, and I kind of give my my take on why philosophy is necessary. So I think that would be a good start. But I also recommend Manly P. Hall's teachings. He has a book called Lectures on Ancient Philosophy that I really recommend. It was written in 1928, and that's a classic. He has another book called First Principles of Philosophy that I recommend. Or you can just go and listen to some of his lectures online. You can find them on YouTube. Just search Manly P. Hall. So that would be, I think, a good starting point. And then I talk about these issues, particularly in my new book. I have a long essay that is the conclusion of the book. It's like almost a whole chapter into itself, and I kind of give this whole vision about a society, like how we get from the present crises into this sort of more philosophic age that I envision for the future. And so I kind of give my big vision for that. And then one thing we haven't talked about, and I guess we will have time to, but if you go to my podcast and look at some of my more recent work, I talk a lot about time cycles, and I relate this. We talked about archetypes in the conversation, so I talk about time cycles in relation to the dynamics of this metaphysical field and the archetypal powers that are there, and how these things drive, human evolution and human destiny. And so I talk about the great year, the cosmic cycle of the great year, which is about a 25,000 year period. And I share some interesting research that suggests that we're at a critical phase of this long millennia spanning cycle, that we're actually at the end of one age and the beginning of another. And I discuss that in some detail, and I talk about how these various topics that we've been discussing about the crises of the present moment and the opportunities, how these things are reflected in this idea of a great cycle undergoing a death rebirth experience, or death rebirth ritual almost, and that we're living out that process. So those are definitely things I think your audience might be interested in.
Beautiful. Thank you, Alex, for sharing your insight and wisdom. Thank you for your invitation. Thank you for your time, energy, and love for showing up here and sharing with me and our audience. Thank you for,
of course, thank you very much.
Guiding to evolution.
Yeah, it was nice chatting with you.
Thank you.